An orchid, white flower study on a white surface without any white pigment. Line drawing is done. Be sure that when you are transferring line drawing, you don't push too hard pencil so you have very, very light lines. Removing excess amount of graphite with an elastic eraser, and if needed, erase a little bit more, but be careful, don't rub too hard, you can damage paper surface. Mixing watercolors for this orchid flower. We are looking mostly on shadow areas and of course that middle part. For the shadow, I'm taking lemon yellow with little touch of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue, diluting it with water so I have a really pale gray watercolor mix. Adjusting pigments, adding a little bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit of ultramarine blue, till I have this gray watercolor mix that is neutral and it's more to cool side. Testing on a piece of paper. On this camera, on this screen view, it's slightly different than it is in real life. I'm mixing another one, also using lemon yellow, alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. But the main thing about this gray watercolor mix is to have it as light as possible. Don't use too much pigment. Use like I'm taking from my pan a tip of pigment and add it to my mixing palette. Again, testing on a piece of paper. The first one is more to blue violet side and the second one is gray to green side. Separately adding lemon yellow for the middle part of orchid, perlin violet separately, and Indian yellow also separately for the middle part of this beautiful orchid flower. After mixing watercolors, be sure that you change your water that is completely clean, and when we will be applying with round synthetic brush watery layer, it is clean water, and be sure also that you really carefully washed your brushes so there's no yellow pigment or perlin violet pigment left in your brush. And starting with water layer and super transparent amount of gray watercolor mix that we have, applying with round synthetic brush on the left side, which I see from the reference has a little bit more of shadow. On the screen it is very hard to see color just because I apply it super transparently. With first layer, don't rush with too dark watercolor mixes. Better to have much lesser amount rather than add a little bit too much of that dark gray and then boom, you can't fix it anymore. With white flower, we will not be adding so much layer as we usually do, but it's more about looking at reference and seeing only shadows. You don't even need to think about the white areas of this orchid flower. The white areas will appear automatically as you will add shadow. I'm not thinking about whites. My paper is my whites. Nothing can be whiter than paper. I'm only looking at shadows. Shadow on the petal, little freckled details, and also cast shadow area, the beautiful cast shadow area that is visible from the petals, from the upper two petals. Here I'm applying first layer for the cast shadow area. Taking finer tip brush for greater precision. Especially with cast shadow area, we want to make it precise, that it's touching the edge of the upper petal and smoothly blending gradually on the lower petal from darker, that is closer to the upper petal, and gradually it becomes lighter. smoothing with clean and dry brush, adding a little bit more to the other side. I waited a few moments for the surface to get completely dry, and using a razor, I'm erasing outer edge of graphite that is still visible. I can see in real life from screen, I think you can't even notice the graphite, but it's better to have them as less as possible. Only you can see those outlines. Be sure that when you transfer that you really did it super lightly. Adding a little bit more of cast shadow area, making it darker. We are building shadow saturation gradually. And now that the surface is dry of the petal that we just painted, I'm adding some details that I see in the reference. They are a little bit darker, but again, everything is done super lightly. The watercolor mix, gray watercolor mix on my palette, as you can see, is so light that you almost think that maybe it's an empty space, but no, that's enough of gray watercolor mix for this white flower shadow. We don't need super dark watercolor mix, then we can go too dark too quickly and this orchid will not look white, but it can look just dirty. Paint lightly, slowly, transparently. Moving forward with the upper petal, which is really small, but the upper tip is with shadow area, and again we are looking only at the shadow. And if we compare all three petals that we see on the upper part, then the upper part of the smallest petal is in the shadow, then it becomes light, and then those two petals on left and right, they have darker edges compared to the upper petal. That's what we are looking at, only at the shadow area, comparing which is darker, which is lighter, and not touching light area. I apply water on the whole surface of petal, but I'm not placing gray watercolor mix on the whole surface. I'm placing only where I see in the reference that this is visible. Using round synthetic brush, I start from upper red corner that is clearly visible darker, and then we have this darker middle line and a little bit on the lower part. And that's it. Now I'm cleaning and drying my brush and smoothing the applied watercolor layer. I don't have any more watercolor mix on my brush. It is clean and I'm smoothing the applied watercolors. Mixing another amount of gray watercolor mix using ultramarine blue, lemon yellow, and alizarin crimson. You can test your 3 pigments of yellow, red, and blue, but be sure that you use super small amount of pigment. Dilute it with water to get a transparent gray watercolor mix that you can use. I still have a very light amount of watercolor mix in my round synthetic brush, so I go ahead and use the watercolor mix in my brush. But this is really small area. Maybe you better paint with finer tip brush. If you are confident in your brush strokes, you can go ahead and use round synthetic brush. I'm using it because I still have some watercolor mix in it. Wait a few moments, the surface is dry and I'm erasing outlines of graphite that is still visible. Zooming closer, and we have some shadow area in the middle part, transparently and lightly. It's almost like I'm painting with invisible colors, but that's the transparency of the amount of watercolors I use. And layer upon layer upon layer, it starts to become darker. You need to be really gentle with white flowers. Using lemon yellow and starting to paint the beautiful middle part. There are so many little details, so use your finer brush. Also, don't rush the stage, and painting with the very tip of the brush. Using Perlin Violet, transparent, starting with transparent amount because it's also super strong pigment. We don't want to use the strength of this pigment right away. Placing little details that we see from reference. I truly suggest you zoom in closer reference that you can download, open it right beside the tutorial or on the other gadget, and zoom as close as possible the middle part so you can clearly see what is going on there, because there are so many things happening and we have multiple layers there of some curved parts of flower. Then this middle, it looks like head of a tiger or a gepard. I can't really tell, but it almost looks like a little head with all those beautiful spots. As you are adding little dots and lines, you don't need to be 100 precise as is the reference. You can have some extra dot or maybe a lesser amount of dots, but you need to be as close as possible to the lines, how they are structured. You can't just place dots here and there without thinking. In the reference, we can clearly see that this little head in the middle, it is curved in the middle part of that head, becomes slightly darker, and those spots are also curved. So we need to follow the structure of those lines and dots, but we can have them maybe not 27, I'm just thinking that up, but maybe 25 or maybe 30. It's not like you don't need to be 100% accurate, but you need to follow the structure, the lines, how they are formed, where the direction of the lines. Maybe some dots are also slightly curved in the section where that little head is curved. So that is important, not the amount of those dots, but how they look in the reference. That is important. Taking Pearl and Violet and using the very tip of my brush, adding a crisp edge. Where we see in the reference, there's also this crisp edge around this these little center part petals. And it's a little bit goes into lemon yellow section, but very lightly. Do this part lightly. I'm adding alizarin crimson to my Pearl and Violet because I just feel that I need a little bit more red color tone. Pearl and Violet is too heavy for this area, so I'm adding a little bit of alizarin crimson to make it more vibrant. And again, using tip of the brush, it's almost like with the stippling, you add those details and carefully build layers. This middle part is inside the flower and it's in the shadow. That I will be adding a little bit later. And there are some reds in the shadow, grays also. We are doing it really slowly and gradually. Taking Indian yellow and adding to this little head in the middle to make it more vibrant. Taking alizarin crimson, and with the stippling I'm adding in the middle part, the part that is curved and it's more deeper. Take a closer look at the reference. You will notice that it's not flat, that little head isn't flat, it is curved, and the curved section is in the shadow. And the more I studied reference, I noticed that behind this center part, there are a little bit side visible of little dots on the inside behind that center part, and I'm adding the color Perlin Violet with alizarin crimson, really light amount, and with the tip of my brush I'm adding little dots here on the one side and on the other side. And I noticed that because I'm constantly looking at the reference. It's very close. I'm zooming each section that I'm working on, and the more I look, the more I start to notice what is happening there. Building more contrast with the shadow around the center part of orchid flower, and we still need to add some contrast. Compared to the reference, shadow is more darker than my painting has. Constantly checking reference. You can notice that when my brush is pausing, it means that I just look in the reference. And even though I painted these sections, I'm still looking because maybe I can see a little bit more. Maybe I need to go another tonal value higher. Zooming out, and let's look at the whole flower and add some contrast where we need to. We have all areas already painted, but now it's the time to add a little bit more darkness to some shadow area. The center part, where's this little head, it also requires of shadow. It needs to go a little bit more inside into the depth of this flower. In the reference, we can see that it's in the shadow because those little petals that are curved from both sides, little ones, they are casting shadow on that little head and all that red section that we have. So I need to go a little bit darker, but again, we are doing that gradually, slowly, constantly checking and comparing with the reference. Also, cast shadow needs to go a little bit more darker, and as you are adding cast shadow, maybe you also need to correct the edge of the lighter part of the petal. That is also possible while you are adding shadow area. You are painting more crisper and precise area of the lighter part. Look for details. Constantly search in the reference photo, especially with white flowers, details in the shadow, like little curves, spots, maybe lines like we have in the middle of orchid flower petals, some lines. Then cast shadows are helping us build realistic subject of white flower on the white paper. And I'm constantly working with the shadow, only with the shadow. I'm not touching white area, but also important not to overpaint white area while you are adding shadow. Look in the reference, shadows are just in some areas, leaving some parts completely exposed to light. Also, I'm not outlining edges of this orchid. I'm adding shadow where it is needed. There are no visible dark lines around the petals, just some curved areas of the petal which creates shadow area. Taking Perlin Violet with alizarin crimson and making those spots a little bit darker and brighter. I'm finishing up this white flower study. It's a really amazing opportunity to study white flower. You can do it in the sketchbook. Don't worry to get it wrong, to make it a little bit darker in the beginning. That is the learning process, and by doing some mistakes, that's how we are learning. You can't be perfect, not in the first time and not in the 10th time. That's completely normal to make mistakes, but important is to learn from our mistakes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for painting. This is last assignment of our art contest, and we will choose winners on January 31st. Thank you, and see you in my next tutorials.